Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that the Future of Freedom Foundation brings you every week that talks about the burning issues of the day. And as happens every week, I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with them.
Yeah, well, speaking of burning issues of the day, I thought we would discuss the big statue controversy dealing with Civil War statues that's going on, all the events in Charlottesville and then Boston and across the country in which you have the racist white supremacists protesting the removal of these Civil War statues, and you've got the other side saying, well, you know, there's nothing wrong with the statues. So I thought, well, this is something that we should discuss, maybe delve into some of the issues relating to the Civil War and treason. That's a word that's been thrown out here about people in the South, like Robert E. Lee. So, Richard, let me just start out with what really is a basic fundamental principle of libertarianism, and then I'll turn it over to you for some perspectives. But I think that the first basic question that has to be asked is, what business is it of government to be building statues? I mean, why is this a legitimate function of government? You know, we libertarians say that the state should be limited to three primary functions, and that is a criminal justice system to punish people who are initiating violence against others, murderers, rapists, thieves, and so forth. To provide a judiciary so people can resolve their disputes peacefully. If somebody gets in a contract dispute, they don't have to go into the street and shoot it out. They can go into court and resolve their disputes before an independent tribunal. And then to defend the country in case the country is ever invaded. Well, what does this have to do with building statues? It seems to me that if people want to honor somebody on either side of a conflict or honor anybody, that they're free to go out there and start their own little park, put up whatever statues they want, establish a private museum. So as far as I'm concerned, the state should have never erected any of these statues anywhere, either for Grant or Sherman or Lincoln or any of these other guys. It seems to me this should be an entirely private function. So I'll throw that out to you as a way to start the conversation.
Well, I want you to know that if it's ever necessary, I will make a small but noticeable contribution to build a private statue to you.
Oh, that's very kind, Richard. That is very, very nice. Why don't you do it with your own money?
That's a different matter, but we'll talk about that. No, but seriously, the entire issue of these statues is one that you touched upon. And that is, it certainly is a long tradition for governments to build monuments to themselves and to their leaders. We can go back to the building of the pyramids as tombs for the pharaohs, all done by, dare I say, slave labor, or the building of the Great Wall of China, all done with slave labor, and then the Colosseum in Rome, which attracts tourists and have for centuries from around the world, from the time of the Roman Empire. Now these are used as monuments to be awestruck by and to reflect and contemplate. But given that the government has built these things for various and sundry reasons, it seems to me that the classical libertarian position would be privatize these. Clearly there are some people who find objectionable, for various historical reasons, a public monument statement of those whom they identify with, at least partially, if not primarily, a cause that was connected with human slavery. Those who object to these things could in fact choose to participate in the bidding to privatize these things and to just tear it down. Others could choose to purchase them or acquire them through some type of arrangement, and keep them in a private area, a private park, as you're suggesting. All of those are the avenues to do this. The difficulty in this issue is not to privatize them, which I agree, that would be the solution to all of this. The issue is that the statutes have become part of a wider conflict and challenge to a variety of issues that confront us about American history. It is absolutely the case that the darkest and most blemished spot on American history for its first over 100 years was the institution of slavery. No one can read, for example, the editorials and articles that William Lloyd Garrison wrote as a famous anti-abolitionist in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, with great eloquence on the immorality, the cruelty, the inhumanity. Indeed, in the first issue of the Liberator in 1831, he had an essay that he wrote with great eloquence about the hypocritical contrast in Washington, D.C. itself. On the one hand, it's meant to stand as a monument to self-government and a free people, to liberty. And yet there, in a part of the town near the waterfront, are chain gangs of slaves being put on ships to be transported to the South, to be put into bondage for the rest of their lives. What can be considered moral or just in this? Or the speeches that someone like Charles Sumner gave in the 1850s on the immorality of slavery in the eyes of both God and any decent man of conscience. And you read them and you realize that this antipathy towards blacks and the willingness to acquiesce or even demand slavery was both in the North and the South for much of that time before the Civil War. There's no doubt about that. But the fact is that this has become part of a wider issue that cannot be ignored, and that is that it has become sort of a stereotypical battle between those who are extremely small minority, if you consider 325 million people in the United States, of what's called the alt-right, white nationalists, KKK, neo-Nazis. I mean, we're talking about what? 0.0001% of the entire population. And then on the other side, you have this anti-fas, which is just meant to be the anti-fascists, who are, the hardcore of them are basically leftist, communist, collectivist thugs who identify everything with a desire to tear down capitalism that they consider the institutional basis of all evil in society. Theirs is just the latest permutation of socialism and Marxist ideology. And these statues really are just sort of a symbol to be used by both sides for the wider conflict about what is the nature of America. How does America face and admit the imperfections of the past, yet at the same time not ignore the fact that the very people who sometimes owned slaves, Jefferson, George Washington, the list can go on, obviously, at the same time were conflicted in themselves, were morally driven by a division in their heart, that they had came to the idea that each individual has certain national rights, yet at the same time caught in an institutional setting that condoned and even was still acquiescing in the legitimacy of slavery, and how one escaped from this, and how one even adjusted and calibrated one's own conduct to one's own ideas and ideals. So one has to try to be dispassionate about this. One has to be thoughtful and historically reflective about it. And those who are either arrogant on either side of these debates, I would just ask them to think with a degree of humility about how people will view them 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when they look back on our era and see inconsistencies, hypocrisies, contradictions, immoralities, injustices, which people today complacently say, well, what's wrong with that? This is the way things operate. This is proper and natural. But one hopes as men's ideas improve and progress over time towards liberty, many of our own citizens' actions will be viewed as reflections of a collectivism and a statism which they themselves in their mind had neither understood or had been able to overcome. So the answer to this is just privatize them somehow, give them away, sell them at public auction, diffuse that element. But it really is indicative of a wider conflict about the soul of America. Shall it be based upon individualism and individual liberty and limited constitutional government, with the acceptance of the imperfections and contradictions and hypocrisies of those who laid the foundations of a society of liberty, but themselves were caught in a system of tyranny in their minds and in their actions? And those who want to remake the world in a Marxist fashion of tearing everything down with their own ideologies of tribalism and collectivism. And we have to try to transcend that.
Yeah, I think you're right that this whole statute controversy is really reflective of something much deeper that's going on. I mean, I find it interesting that, you know, up to recently, I don't know of anyone that was making these statutes a big deal. I mean, certainly when I was growing up, they were no big deal. And in the last, several decades, I never heard of this controversy. And all of a sudden it erupts that all these statutes have to be coming down. And part of it's motivated by the alt-right and the white supremacists and so forth, and the bigotry in American society. I mean, you're absolutely right. Slavery goes to the very core of violating libertarian principles. I mean, you couldn't find a better example of a violation of freedom principles than slavery. But, you know, Richard, the real question is why is there still so much racism and bigotry in American society? As you'll recall, in our very first year of FFF, you were serving as Vice President of Academic Affairs. I was, of course, the President. And I forget which issue of Future of Freedom, which at that time was called Freedom Daily, our monthly journal, it was. But we addressed anti-discrimination laws. And we were arguing that in a genuinely free society, people would have the right to discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, or whatever. And that our argument was that this was a way to diffuse the consequences of bigotry and racism. I mean, clearly that's part of any society generally. People are going to have these racial bigotries. But if you have their ability, if they have the ability to exercise their bigotry in a private market, like not selling to people in a retail store because of they're Jews or because they're blacks or so forth, that's like a pressure cooker that's able to be released. But when you make it illegal to do that in a private market, the pressure cooker builds bigger and bigger and bigger until it finally explodes. And I think that's what's going on here. I mean, if you look at the private sector like country clubs, they are free to discriminate, and yet nobody makes a big deal out of that. I mean, there might be a protest against some country club or some private club on a purely private basis, but society has learned to accommodate this. And I think society would have learned to accommodate discrimination in the private sector had it been legal and free as it would be in a genuinely free society, and that would have been the best way to deal with racism and bigotry. By preserving the principles of freedom. They didn't do that. Now here's another factor to consider. Imagine how weird it would have been if people had been protesting in 1859 against racism and bigotry and never mentioning slavery. You know, just going out there and saying peace and love and never mentioning ending slavery. Or segregation. Suppose people were in Birmingham, Alabama in '64 protesting in favor of peace and love and against racism and bigotry, but remaining totally silent on segregation. Well, that's the way I see it with respect to the drug war. Here you have the most racist government program in our time. I think it's possibly even more racist than segregation. I mean, under segregation, they would leave blacks in the community, but just separate them, not permit them to use the front row of a bus or something, or a water fountain or a bathroom. here with the drug war, it's the perfect opportunity for the bigots in society to remove blacks entirely from society and relocate them into federal and state penitentiaries, and then cause them to lose their vote. Is that if we really want to do something meaningful, it seems to me, on the racist bigotry front, is get rid of the drug war. And yet I don't see any mass movement. I see a lot of people that are pushing for that. But I mean, here is where it seems to me you'd have a much more meaningful message as compared to tearing down a statue. If you want to get rid society of the consequences of racism and bigotry, get rid of what the noted scholar Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow.
Yeah, a couple of things here. First of all, on this entire issue of, should the statues be torn down? Recently, since this whole thing happened in Charlottesville, there's been several public opinion polls and asking Republicans and Democrats, whites and blacks, how do you feel, liberals and conservatives, how do you feel about these statues? And amazingly, a large plurality, if not a majority, a small majority of the people don't care. And even when you obviously conservatives and Republicans, not surprisingly, say the statue shouldn't be taken down. But even a sizable minority of Democrats don't think this should happen. And then most interesting, in the public opinion polls I've seen, National Public Radio had this. That can't be accused to be a bastion of conservative reactionary thought. 43% of blacks participating in the poll said the statue shouldn't be taken down. So there is no consensus of everybody against a few small people who want to worship at the statue feet of some white supremacist captured in a statue. I mean, this is just not the case. The entire issue, and every statue could be torn down, and we would still be left with the type of problems that you're mentioning, Jacob. Will it help black youths that you've torn down statues when minimum wage laws, which are now being pushed up around the country to $15 an hour, are pricing unskilled high school dropouts out of the labor market and leaving them with no economic opportunity for escape, and therefore either to rely purely upon state welfare redistribution and or to be caught up in the illegal drug business? Are we improving the situation for blacks when we have regulatory agencies and licensing and building and business codes that make it so difficult for people with small amount of capital, that is financial resources, to be able to start up their own business and be self-employed, and therefore not have to take handouts if they feel uncomfortable doing so from the state, and being self-supporting in some modest way? Is it helping anybody, as you're saying, with a drug war that criminalizes what should be viewed as basically consenting actions among adults, regardless of whether you approve of their conduct or not? But once alcohol prohibition was ended in 1933, all the crime went out of it. All the people being sent to jail for the manufacture, distribution, sale of alcohol were no longer being put into prisons. The same thing would happen with decriminalization, which, as you say, has fallen disproportionately on members of the African American community. And the perversity of it is that it really isn't. Who's been most for such laws? It's often historically been progressive elites in the idea of remaking human nature, transforming the human condition, remolding human relationships through the powers and regulations of the state. All of those who were named, and that has nothing to do with freedom of association, that has nothing to do with the market economy, that has to do with the interventions, regulations, controls, restrictions, and prohibitions of the state. That is the political authority through those who hold power as politicians and bureaucrats. That will remain enforced and act as a detrimental stumbling block to the improvements of many people in the society, especially in the minority communities.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, okay, libertarians say why should the state be building statues, but this isn't our great cause. I mean, we certainly would oppose the state being involved in this. As you point out, we're talking about what Walter Williams, the African American libertarian economist at George Mason, called a state against blacks. I mean, this is the moral high ground that libertarians carry, is getting rid of the state infringements on liberty of everyone, but especially where the consequences fall disproportionately on blacks. I mentioned the drug war. You mentioned minimum wage laws. I mean, there's a reason why the black teenager unemployment rate in inner cities is chronically, year after year, 40% or so. That's because of minimum wage laws. And then you've got these ridiculous licensure laws that keep African Americans out of the law profession, being lawyers, hairdressers, any number of professions, because they're privileged rackets for mostly white people, white well-to-do people that can afford those huge fees to go through those courses to get the license. It's all a big racket. I mean, this is where the attention of people who are concerned about racism and bigotry should be focused on, the real impediments to African Americans and others advancing because of state impediments. But let me shift the course of the conversation a little bit back to the Civil War. There's been a lot of talk about Robert E. Lee being a traitor, and that's why these statues ought to be coming down. I mean, some of them is because some of these guys were slaveholders, but that leads the advocates that are using that reason for tearing down the statues in a very awkward position, because of the fact that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others of the founding fathers were slaveholders. So if you're going to tear down statues for that reason, that puts people in a little awkward position that don't want to tear down the statues of Washington and Jefferson and Madison and the rest of the founding fathers. Now, there's no question, Richard, that the South wanted to secede partly, if not in large part, to preserve slavery. I mean, you can see that in the founding documents of the Confederacy. But still, we have to separate out that there was a secession taking place here, and that many people simply said there is a right to secede. And there had to have been people in the South that were even opposed to slavery, but said, hey, we have a right to secede here. And if you have a right to secede, the motive then becomes irrelevant. Because once you have a right, then that right can be exercised regardless of motivation. For example, if a white supremacist says, I have a right to read whatever books I want, and I want to read white supremacist neo-Nazi books and Mein Kampf, well, his motive may be bad, but we would argue he has a right to do that. That's what freedom of speech is all about. So the issue turns, is there a right of secession? Should people be forced to associate with others when they've chosen not to? And from that sense, clearly, if you don't agree that there's a right of secession, then you would say Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis were traitors because they took up arms against their own government. However, that places the person in a very difficult position as well, who takes that position that there is no right of secession. Because if you go back to the American Revolution, it really wasn't a revolution. A revolution is when the revolutionaries are trying to take over the government and run the government. That's not what they were doing in 1776. What were they doing? They were seceding. And, oh, by the way, they were traitors too. I mean, if you look at what King George was saying, he was saying these are traitors. When you look at the 1/3 of the colonists who sided with their own government, the British government, because these were British citizens. Washington was English. Jefferson was English. They were as much English citizens as you and I are Americans. They were taking up arms against their own government in the act of seceding from the government. Now, here's one of the ironical parts of this, is that I can understand why African Americans would not be terribly excited about the English colonists winning this secession, because England then succeeds in ending slavery peacefully in 1833 by simply enacting legislation. That was 20 years, 30 years before blacks here were freed through a violent civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then as a native Texan, I should point out that Texas seceded from Mexico. So if a nation is indissoluble, if people do not have a right to secede, well, then that would have meant that Texas belonged and maybe still belongs to Mexico if a nation truly is indissoluble. Seems to me that when people no longer want to associate with another nation, whether they're English colonists in America, whether they're Confederates in the South, whether they're Texans, that they should have the right to secede, even if their motives are evil, even if their motives are wrong, because of that right of non-association, to me, is a fundamental right. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that one of the tragedies of the Civil War, besides many that can be enumerated, is in precisely the point that you've raised, and that is the blurring of the logical distinction and the practical difference between the principle of a right of secession and the issue of why a person wishes to secede. Now, the internet is a wonderful thing, and in the age of Googling, one can go online and instantaneously take up all the documents that have been scanned of the statements of secession by the southern states: South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Virginia, and what you see at Texas, and what you find in those states that made the most detailed, articulated reason for their secession. There might have been reasons about the tariff. Oh, we're being taxed to protect northern industries at the expense of southern agricultural states that want to more freely trade with the rest of the world. Absolutely. But you find that those are almost addendums to the primary reason articulated by those state governments themselves as to why they were doing this. A continuation of unity within the United States threatens to undermine the fabric and the bedrock institution upon which their societies were founded and would be threatened. That is the end to slavery. That is what they wish to preserve. That is what they want to defend. That is what they're willing to fight to maintain. There is no doubt about that. You just read their words. But precisely because, both at the time in the eyes of so many Americans, and certainly Europeans, and especially the British, and then generations after, the reason for wanting to secede has been viewed as so morally repugnant. I want to be free so I can deny liberty to those who I have control over. That it has totally blurred this very point that you're making. If there had not been slavery, if no man was held in bondage in any of the southern states, and if it was merely a matter of the people of those states holding a plebiscite, let us say, and saying, we disagree with the tariff policies, we disagree with the allocation of those tariff revenues for internal improvements biasly against us, even though we're bearing the tax burden, or other political issues that seem to be unsolvable. Could one make the same dogmatic case against the right of the southern states to secede if the slavery issue is taken out of the equation? And I would answer no. It would be exactly the same thing that has come up with the American Revolution or the Declaration of Independence by the state of Texas or other countries that broke away from conquering masters throughout history. Do people have a right to be self-governing in the two senses: the selection of the government under which they shall live and elect the representatives who are to enforce the laws which are meant to protect their liberty, and are to be they self-governing individuals, or are they to be denied those senses of self-governing, both personal freedom over their own lives and the selection of the government and the representatives who they wish to put in office? That is the fundamental issue of secession. And tragically, the slavery issue has blurred that profoundly political, philosophic problem that any free society must confront.
Well, and here's another factor, is the reason that Lincoln initiated the war against the South in the first place. I mean, it was clear that his objective was not to free the slaves. That became his objective much later, after he realized that hundreds of thousands of people had died, and for a cause, a political cause that was involved no secession. And so that seemed to me that's not the most noble of things to kill and sacrifice hundreds of thousands of people for. But he made it very clear from the beginning that this was about preserving the Union.
Yes.
In other words, stopping secession. And if you asked what the average Yankee soldier what he was fighting for, he would have said to preserve the Union. Then later, as this massive death and destruction starts taking its toll, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. But even then, that's proof that his initial objective was not to free the slaves, because he didn't free the slaves entirely with the Emancipation Proclamation. He kept some of them still enslaved. If his objective was to free all the slaves from the get-go, why not emancipate all the slaves instead of just some of them? So the reason that Lee and Jackson and Davis and these guys are considered traitors, Richard, is they lost. I mean, the reason that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are considered patriots is they won. But if you look at it from the English government standpoint, those were traitors. If you look at it from the U.S. government standpoint, they were traitors. But if they had won and there was a Confederate States of America, they would be extolled as the founding fathers of America. The reason that William Barrett Travis and Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett are considered patriots is because they won. Their side won. But I guarantee you, Santa Anna didn't consider them patriots or heroes or anything. He considered them brigands, criminals, and traitors.
Yeah, in fact, it gets to that famous phrase of Benjamin Franklin at the time of the Declaration of Independence, in which he said, we need to all hang together or we will hang separately. And that was the idea, that from the British point of view, they were acting in a treasonous and traitor-like fashion to attempt to break away and deny the king and the Parliament their jurisdictional authority over those 13 colonies. To the victor always goes the spoils. And if I can just, again, history is a complex thing. And we need to appreciate the nuances, not just to understand the past, but to hopefully temper those who will look at us, as I was suggesting earlier, 100 years from now, and evaluate our imperfections, inconsistencies, hypocrisies, contradictions, and failure to act consistently on principles that they, 100 years from now, will say, why weren't they purer about? The fact is, as you said, Lincoln was long an anti-slavery advocate. You just read much in his Lincoln-Douglas debate speeches. But the fact is that he was concerned with preserving the Union. And as he said famously, if preserving the Union requires me to abolish slavery, I will abolish slavery. If preserving the Union requires me to accept and keep slavery intact, I will do so. The fact is that he only issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 for a variety of practical reasons. A, the war was going bad for the South. It was not for the North. For the North. He was not sure that they would succeed and prevent Southern secession. It might end up being a stalemate, an unending stalemate, draining lives and taxpayer wealth. There was disgruntlement to fund the Northern armies in the Congress. And he decided that he needed the support of the abolitionists, who found his actions at one level Republican. Why are you fighting to preserve the South? If the South, if they're defeated, will be allowed to keep slavery, the institution that is an abomination against our founding principles, we don't support you, President Lincoln, because you're fighting a civil war for the wrong reason. He needed the abolitionist vote. He needed more moral support because in 1863 there were draft riots in New York by people objecting to be conscripted into the Northern Army, and dozens, I forget the number, maybe hundreds, but certainly dozens of people were killed in these draft riots. And then it was a pragmatic issue, as you said. Where were the slaves freed by the proclamation, in the Emancipation Proclamation? Within those parts of the southern states still under the military and political control of the Confederate government, not in the border states that had stayed loyal to the North, or in those portions of the southern secessionist states that had been occupied so far by the Northern armies. That's why you had to add an amendment to the Constitution. to formalize that. This had nothing. It's all blurred together, and one has to understand these contexts. And then one other point, Jacob, if I may. From what I've read, Robert E. Lee was not an enthusiast for slavery. In fact, he spoke against it. He was offered the opportunity to be the lead general of the Northern armies by President Lincoln. He turned it down, from my reading of this. Why did he turn it down? Because of his sense of a regional loyalty to the state of Virginia. We lose sight that in people's minds, attitudes, belief systems, America wasn't the United States, one and indivisible. It was a compact of states. You were born in your state. You lived in your state. Communications and transportation meant that your entire life might be spent within the jurisdiction of your region, your county, your state. You had these local loyalties that transcended the federal government in ways that people don't even think about today, and makes them not understand the historical and institutional context in which people had to make difficult decisions of moral conscience and practical affairs, why families were divided. And unless one appreciates this, however much we continue and rightly condemn slavery as an institution, we forget the nuanced complexities of individual people's lives and the problems and decisions they were confronting at that time.
That is a fantastic point, because as you know, even the term the United States before the Civil War was used in the plural sense.
Not is.
The United States are a great nation or whatever, because they saw it as a compact of individual states that had come together. And so you were a citizen of the state from whatever your state was. So when Lee says, and you're right, he declines the commission to head the U.S. Army. He had served as a West Point superintendent. He had been in the Spanish-American War, not the Spanish-American War, the Mexican War. And so he says, no, out of a sense of loyalty to my homeland, to my country. That what was motivating him. There was also a Supreme Court justice who famously did the same thing. I mean, this guy, he was serving a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. He resigns out of a sense of loyalty to his home state of Louisiana. I forget his name. He ends up representing the people in the slaughterhouse cases as their lawyer after the war was over. And so there was this sense of patriotism and loyalty that a lot of them expressed, independent of whether they were slave owners or believed in slavery or not. There was that sense of, hey, this is the right thing to do. We've got to fight for our country. And I also want to point out, Richard, that if there had been secession and it had been recognized, it would have been a perfect way to also get rid of slavery entirely peacefully by having the northern part, the United States, serve as a sanctuary for blacks. Yes. Before that, you had the fugitive slave law where they had to return slaves, and the Supreme Court upholds this. It would have been a totally different deal now with two separate countries, where you could have an underground railroad, no slaves would be returned, and as you know, slavery was highly inefficient anyway. It was, in large part, it was dying out because slavery was a burden in many instances. So if all of a sudden you're breaking the back of slavery with an underground railroad where slaves don't have to be repatriated, the whole equation would have changed very likely. Finally, I want to point out the war crimes, that Lincoln and Sherman and Grant participated in, that I think added to the anger and rage over generations, where people would tell their children, tell your children about this, and tell them to tell their children about what these three guys did in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and what they did in their march to Atlanta, where they were targeting women and children for starvation and senior citizens, trying to kill them in order to demoralize the soldiers for the Confederacy who were still fighting. I mean, that's a war crime in its purest sense. It violated all the rules of warfare that had been established over centuries in Europe. You don't target women, you don't target children, but that's what they were doing by burning their homes, burning their fields. They were trying to kill these women and children and seniors indirectly in order to try to demoralize the troops. And so while we're talking about statues to people, maybe we shouldn't overlook that these guys, if they had lost, would have ended up in a penitentiary or worse the war crimes that they committed in the Shenandoah Valley and on their march to Georgia.
Yes, we talk about war crimes today. Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons, Assad in Syria today dropping these barrel bombs and so on, and a variety of things. But if we were to use the standards of a war crime today, right, the Hague Court in Holland, and judge the past, there is no doubt in my mind that Abraham Lincoln and Grant would have warrants for their arrest today. Even if you count World War II, the planned and intentional terror bombings of German cities by both the British, especially the British, and the Americans during the Second World War, would in principle put Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and their leading military strategists with warrants for their arrest as war crimes. Now, I'm not whitewashing it. At the same time, you would expect arrest warrants by these current modern standards for Adolf Hitler and Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, for his terror bombings of British cities. But if one were to apply this equally and even-handedly, the great leaders, the great statesmen, and the leading generals of those earlier wars and conflicts, if they were to be held by the standards that we now say publicly, political leaders and military figures must be judged, they too would all be in the docket for these terrible crimes against innocent men, women, and children.
Yeah, and we also shouldn't forget Lincoln's jailing of members of the Maryland legislature. I mean, let's face it, Lincoln exercised dictatorial powers. And so when we're creating these statutes for Lincoln or Grant or whatever, I think it's important to point out that we're also at the same time justifying dictatorship, war crimes, and other things that are really not anything to be admired or respected for. Richard, on that note, we're out of time. Enjoyed the conversation and look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next week, I want to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us again. Thank you.